Well, I'm not too familiar with sort of your background, your origin story. I know I was listening to the Stoa talk the other day, and Peter Lindbergh was talking about how you guys were part of a sense making community, and so I was hoping you guys could just tell our listeners how'd you meet, how'd you get into Future Thinkers, and how it all came about.
Should I go with my standard answer to that?
Sure.
RussianBrides.com. I always no, actually, we met on OkCupid dating website, and that was in 2010ish, I think.
Yeah, a long time ago.
Yeah,
Almost 10 years ago.
and then we both kind of were weird artist type people. I was working in kind of film and music, and Euvie was working in film, and we decided we want to travel and explore the world. So we started an online business, kind of read the Tim Ferriss 4-Hour Workweek Bible of digital nomadism, and then started a business and got some clients. And I think,
Bought a one-way ticket.
Yeah.
And left
Yeah.
in late 2012.
Yeah, that's right. And then we started our podcast just based off of conversations we were having in the morning time. Because once we had the freedom, being in Asia, we had a little bit more spendable money there, because, lifestyle is pretty inexpensive there. We just took some of our time back. We started reading a lot more books. We started just having longer conversations and, doing thought experiments and just kind of going down rabbit holes as much as we pleased. And then those conversations got more and more interesting, and we decided to start recording them. And we recorded our first episode from a bungalow on the beach side in Thailand.
Yeah, in 2013.
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, the story's long since then. That's just the starting point. But like where the whole podcast has evolved from then has kind of taken a weird track. Like and people who listen to us often say, like, what is inspired from one episode they're reading, like, or they're listening to, goes on to the next one in a very logical fashion. Like it inspires some new ideas, and then we cover that subject in the next episode.
Yeah. So you guys were both interested in similar ideas, and it just kind of gelled together, and you guys were able to just kind of integrate that and flow from that similar passion, huh?
Yeah. Well, we actually come at things from often different experiences and different perspectives, but somehow we end up on the same page. So it's always very interesting because our personalities are completely different. And, Mike in many ways is, in some ways we embody the archetypal feminine and masculine, and the tendencies that come with that. And so it's always this interesting dynamic of trying to be on the same page and figure things out from these different perspectives.
I know from a
Mike is
listening
also...
perspective.
Go ahead.
Yeah, from a listening perspective, it's a nice integration, and it's very refreshing to hear the both masculine and feminine qualities integrated together. Is your vision of how Future Thinkers, when you first started this, is it kind of come to fruition of how you planned it, or has there been many sort of detours along the way?
It's been the one consistently good thing in our lives. Like, as we've worked on different projects, and we're entrepreneurs as well, and we've needed to make some sort of online income ever since we left Canada. And those things have been pretty hard. There's been a lot of failures with that, but Future Thinkers was always that kind of passion project that we always had running in the background. That was just, we always looked forward to it.
And it wasn't our business at first. It was just 100% passion, and we didn't make any money from it for many years. Just, we just put our own money into it. And then eventually, as we picked up traction and had more to offer, then we created paid offerings and got sponsors, and now it's our full-time thing. So it's I'd say we're pretty fortunate to be able to do exactly what we love and to have designed it from the very beginning. And I think that a huge part of that is because it wasn't a paid thing to start with. Like, we designed it exactly as we wanted, as our vision told us to do it, and then we found ways to create paid offerings out of that.
That's awesome. It's very inspiring.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
something we can aspire to on this podcast. And I'm curious, in terms of the philosophies and thought systems that you've studied, was there a particular, like for three of us, our I guess main inroad into the larger sense making community was through integral theory, and we started with Wilbur. Jeremy has his emphasis on Gebser's integral, right? And so there's Game B, there's metamodernism, the Stoas kind of integrating all these things, as are you guys. So was there a particular like thought system that you had kind of centered around that led you to branch out into all these different streams, or was it all kind of like flowing together?
It was a lot of kind of solo work in a way. It was like, a fair amount of experimentation with psychedelics and several decades of meditation. And then a lot of weird, unique experiences being entrepreneurs and traveling around and visiting these different cultures.
And also, I mean, I have to add, like, both of us are pretty weird kids growing up. We were always both of us were the black sheep. So which afforded us a lot of weird and unique experiences, and just being kind of outsiders in society, we tended to question things a lot. So I think I totally agree with you. I think it was just our life experience that led us down this path rather than any specific philosophy.
I suppose having an Audible subscription was helpful too. We just
Definitely.
kind of went in weird directions as we felt like it. Lots of psychology and philosophy and sociology, anthropology, just kind of anywhere. When you do a lot of meditation and psychedelics, there's this kind of overview effect reflecting on human nature and on evolution and on how the mind works. And that in itself, you just have a couple of those experiences and write down what new ideas come about, and then you have your book list for basically a decade.
Mm-hmm.
And that that's pretty much what happened for me anyway.
Yeah, same.
Yeah. I'm curious, did it kind of begin with was regenerative culture, and we could define that for our listeners who aren't familiar with it. Maybe we can get into what that means, but I'm curious if that was there at the beginning, if in some kind of latent or seed form, like was there a desire to reconnect with certain principles of nature? Psychedelic experiences kind of helped sort of redirect your attention towards that, or did you have a disposition towards, eco village, like where you ended up today, which is really inspiring, which is this smart village, and these regenerative principles? Were they in there in the beginning, or like how did you find your way to them?
I think I've always been really into nature, and I've always felt this almost spiritual connection with nature ever since I was a kid. Like nature was more like awe-inducing than any temple or anything else for me. So I've thought about this for a long time, how to live in harmony with nature and how to have a healthy relationship with it. And so that just made its way into my thinking about all subjects. And Mike is really into technology and into processes and figuring out how things work. So those things combined, created what we have now and our vision for this thing now. I don't know if there was any specific moment when it became clear that we have to do that. I think it just evolved over time, just through all of our conversations and experiences. We've lived in all different cultures all over the world and just observed what works and how people live. And one memorable experience was that we're living in Vietnam in Ho Chi Minh City, and people live quite communally there, even though it's I would say for Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh is probably the most individualistic city. But people take care of each other's kids, and they know their neighbors, and people sweep the street just because they want to live in a nice neighborhood. So they kind of take responsibility for themselves. They don't expect handouts, don't expect the government to take care of them, but at the same time they take care of each other. And that was something really really interesting, and it really works. So and then in Bali people live very communally as well. It's interesting to see, because a lot of the time people living in Western cultures assume that that's the way to live and that's, you know, the best way to live, but actually most of the world doesn't live like that. Most of the world is not that individualistic. So yeah, I guess a lot of ideas came from our travels, but I would say it started even before that, at least for me, thinking about how we live in communities. What about you, Mike? Was there any kind of point in your life when you think that you realize that we need eco villages or smart villages or some sort of thing like that?
Well, expanding on the regenerative part, definitely, the unfolding climate crisis has made that pretty obvious that that's kind of a unit of change that we can all participate in that would actually make us more in tune with nature, more prosperous, more in community,
Resilient.
more resilient, would spread the kind of responsibilities that, especially since becoming a parent, we've recognized how difficult it is to have a business, have careers, and be kind of atomized in our little apartment with no help, no external help unless we pay for it. So that's made clear the community aspect when it comes to child rearing.
Takes a village to raise a child.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But as far as the regenerative, or as far as the kind of co-living thing, that was always the most fun point of my life, when I've had a bunch of roommates and we had similar interests, and your social life is just kind of built into your living environment. I really like that. As an introvert, that's kind of my ideal situation, because I'm not going to really put myself out there, um, to go to clubs or whatever and meet people. So more of a homebody, and I've always liked that kind of setup.
Nice.
And I mean, we started doing a regenerative cultures series on our podcast when COVID hit, because it seemed like the right time. It seemed like people were ready for those ideas, and I think that was right. I mean, we've had a lot of new people start listening to our show who weren't before, because we were talking about the regenerative cultures.
Yeah, a natural next question would be, how has this particular year, when anxiety around resources, supply chains, the direction we're headed with, industrial capitalism, the climate crisis, this year, all of that really came to the forefront. So, have you seen a pretty significant spike of new listeners and people who are interested in these questions and kind of asking in their own context, in their own regions, how to get started with a smart village or how to live more resiliently and sustainably?
Interest is way higher than it used to be. But it's kind of funny, like, we've been looking at the future, right, a lot for years now, and trying to figure out, like, what's next, what's happening in society, what is the meta meaning behind what individuals are doing out there. And some sort of collapse of capitalism and Western civilization became kind of obvious several years ago. And then watching it unfold through the lens of the pandemic has been pretty interesting and different, but kind of still in line with the script, or with what we were seeing unfolding. So now what we're thinking about and talking about has just really come to the forefront. It's become kind of a mainstream subject. And with that, there's a lot of interest, excuse me, in living differently, and like getting out of the cities and trying to be regenerative and trying to actually do something that affects climate change. So yeah, like, now is probably the best timing we've ever seen to start a project like this.
I would say one of the things that I'm noticing that's really different is that before people were just entertaining these things as ideas because it's interesting, and now they're actually scrambling to figure out how they can do something about it.
Yeah.
Which is awesome.
Yeah, before diving too much into the Smart Village project, I'm curious, traveling so much, what did you learn along the way that you have picked up and sort of you've learned from different cultures and can incorporate into your Smart Village project?
Good question. That's a tough question too.
I can think of something. Well, for example, in North America, people eat things that are out of season all the time. Just like you feel like eating strawberries in February, sure, whatever. Like people don't even know when seasons are for different fruits and vegetables. Whereas in other parts of the world, people live seasonally, and out of season fruit are a luxury or not even available. Like in Bulgaria, for example, it's, you eat what's in season. And in Asia, same thing. So I'd love to do that more, because it's the most regenerative way to live, and also living on the 100-mile diet, so things that are grown locally rather than flown from across the world. Yeah. What about you, Mike?
You know, I have to preface this by saying I'm not in support of Marxism or communism, but it's been funny to see ex-communist countries and how they are socially. Bulgaria, for example, Vietnam, for example. Often there's a higher degree of poverty because that system really messes up people's economic incentives. And because it kind of tends to centralize power even harder than capitalism does. But the leftovers from the culture are that people are a lot more communal. They take care of each other. They take personal responsibility and it's probably because of a breaking of trust of the government. Like they don't trust government at all, so they don't expect anything of it. And I think that's really interesting. I wish the Western world would just take much more personal responsibility for their lives instead of outsourcing responsibility to companies and governments.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing, because on one hand you said communal and people take care of each other, and on the other hand, taking personal responsibility, because I feel like those things go hand in hand.
Yeah.
Sometimes people assume that, if you're living communally, then you can just, other people will do things for you and you don't have to take personal responsibility. But in order for that communal life to be functional, that's vital. People have to be sovereign individuals, and they also have to take care of each other. Like those two things have to be there. If one of those things is missing, it breaks down. Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like the community is what help to hold people accountable and promote responsibility, right? In a small community.
Exactly.
When I was watching your presentation on the Stoa, something that was exciting to me personally was the emphasis on conflict resolution in the community and kind of how that could go about. And as people who watch the show know, I'm a mediator and I'm in the conflict resolution and mediation field. So it's something I'm very passionate, very interested about. Also thinking about how to scale that and what kind of practices and techniques we can do to help better resolve conflicts when they arise. So I'm just curious. I mean, I'll basically say, like, if you ever want any like help with that or this brainstorm about that, I'd love to chime in there. But have you thought about what that'll look like? Are there different processes or methods that you're thinking about to help resolve conflicts or help people prepare to deal with them better, since they'll inevitably arise in small communal living?
Yeah, lots of conversations about that. We do group calls in our community, and a lot of the subject matter in the Thursday calls ends up being about kind of leaning into discomfort and figuring out how to let go of strong attachments. And so we all kind of work on that with each other. I think that's probably one of the best pathways to conflict resolution, is to recognize that you're going to be okay even if the conflict happens and things kind of break down. Just to not be so attached to the results and to your position, and to allow yourself to lean into any conflict, to like see it through to its resolution. And related to our last point about communal living, like, and taking personal responsibility, there's something, the way we live in the West with this sort of atomized, everyone has their own castle. We don't have to face our neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we're not forced to be in conflict. So we tend to avoid it even more than what we would naturally do if we had more communal living. So that's something we try and encourage people to do. There's a number of kind of patterns when people first jump into the calls with us that we recognize. Like, there's this kind of primate dominance hierarchy thing that happens where, people recognize, oh, this is a group of smart people, so I want to appear smart as well. So they start, projecting how smart they are to the group. But everyone kind of catches on to that pretty quickly and calls it out in a way. And, the group is about really ego dissolution and kind of understanding the meta of human behavior and of society and what happens if we all behave in a certain way. So it's simple. The answer is really simple, I think, to conflict resolution. It's like, don't be so attached and lean in. But those are really hard things to do. It takes like months and months of practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one of the things that we often talk about is that just being human is okay. And everybody fucks up and everybody makes mistakes. And, you know, that doesn't mean that people are bad or worthless.
Yeah.
So owning up to things is something that we value. So if somebody makes a mistake or is rude or whatever, then it's better to own up to it so we can name it so that it doesn't build resentment. And it's better for those things to be out in the open rather than just brewing in the background and then explode in unhealthy ways. Like I know that from experience, because in my family, conflict was never out in the open. Things just brewed in the background, and there was just resentment built up for years, and abuses were going on that some people didn't even know about. So I know what it is when things go wrong with that. So for me, part of the interest in conflict resolution comes from that I've seen how not to do it. So I wanted to learn how to do it properly.
Would you say this is one of the most challenging elements of building a smart village and building this, if smart villages are the future, then it sounds like we're going to have to get a lot better at the art of communication and mediation in terms of actually interpersonal relationship. Mm-hmm.
If you do any research, just Google why smart villages or why regenerative villages or eco villages, mm-hmm. intentional communities, any name for it. Why do they fail? The biggest reason is internal conflict. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's a huge deal. And we didn't even know it was going to be a big deal before we started doing the kind of lean in group calls that we're doing now. But it just kind of turned out that what we were practicing every week was actually super relevant to smart villages. Yeah.
Have you guys watched the Wild Wild Country documentary on Netflix?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we
I know you guys.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
I know you guys
make
sort of a joke reference to the robes when people come on.
Yeah.
And that's probably the worst case scenario. But what do you guys think what will your project be different? How will it not turn into sort of a wild, wild country situation?
Well, if you remember the girl, I forget her name, Sheila or something. She was super combative. Like, okay, well, there's this spiritual guru kind of weird culty stuff. And then there's how that community actually chose to integrate or not into society. And I mean, you can have meditation practices, you can be doing psychedelics, you can have drum circles and whatever. You can do a lot of that kind of externally labeled hippie stuff. But how you integrate into the society and how you choose to resolve conflicts externally is critical. And she did a horrible job of that at every level. She was combative. She would get into fights with the neighbors. And they insisted on everyone wearing like these orange jumpsuits as if that was going to help them integrate into society any better. So yeah, I mean, the perception when we talk about what we're doing often is that we're building a commune. And people think of it because they've seen that documentary and they've seen other kind of stuff like that fall apart or create problems. So, I'm a bit of a troll and I like to incorporate humor into what I do. So I think about like leaning into it a little bit. And, we're going to have this Airbnb component, right? So when you go to an Airbnb, there's generally like robes and towels and stuff. So I thought of doing that kind of culty robe with the Sith hood and everything, orange, bright orange or burgundy or something, and putting that in every one of the Airbnbs. And just having kind of like, there's another thing I wanted to do, which is like a geocaching thing. So you can, use your phone, scan something and go on a bit of a treasure hunt all over the property and learn about different areas. Like if you scan a code over here, then you might get a video that explains something about that region that you're standing in. So, we could embed kind of humorous culty things into that just for fun. But yeah, a big part of it, like I said, is just how are you integrating into the community? Are you choosing not to do that at all? Like, so many of these communities are just running away from society or running away from technology or from Western culture or whatever in trying to create some little haven. And that's not what we're doing. Like,
Yeah.
this is something meant to be replicable and scalable and welcoming to other communities. Like, that's why we focus on the smart and regenerative aspect rather than the spiritual practices, even though there is a component of that. It's like, this needs to be replicable.
Yeah, and the point about it not being closed off, I think, is really important, because the more secretive you make something like this, the more it can go wrong.
Yeah.
And secondly, yeah, our focus is on practical applications rather than some sort of unseen, immeasurable spiritual thing. Like, if you put, let's say, the quest for enlightenment at the center of your community, then, well, who gets to define that? Like, it turns out there are different definitions of something like that depending on who you ask. And it's something that's kind of, it's immeasurable. It's difficult to say, like, oh, is this person enlightened, or how far along are they, or what if they're super spiritual but maybe they're abusive, are they still enlightened? Like, it's difficult to kind of pinpoint, are you actually doing the thing that you say you're doing? But in our case, we're focusing a lot on practices, like physical practices, not just spiritual practices, like regenerating soil or building, eco-friendly, affordable housing. Those things you can actually measure. You can look at it. Like, did you do the thing or did you not do the thing?
Mm-hmm.
So,
and I think the best aspects of spiritual practices tend to be what we've already talked about with conflict resolution. It's ego dissolution, and it's leaning into discomfort. I mean, that's, if you've ever gone on a meditation retreat, that's most of it is just leaning into discomfort. You've got to sit there, even though your mind is racing, or that it's distracted, or you're thinking about your traumas and that kind of thing. You've got to sit there regardless and work through those things.
I think understanding human nature is extremely important too, rather than trying to imagine that we could run away from it or transcend it. And that's, spiritual bypassing is a huge problem in spiritual circles, where people think that they've transcended human nature somehow. I think that, first of all, that premise is just so ass backwards. I can't even. I can't even. Yeah, it's super ass backwards. We don't transcend human nature. We're human, and we need to learn how to live with it gracefully and honorably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like the interpersonal element as a spiritual practice is something that is valuable in terms of scaling and replicating as well, right? Like, in terms of what your community could share with other communities is, hey, this was really successful. This process was really successful for mediating our issues or interpersonal conflicts, etc. Are you guys familiar with the peer-to-peer movement, and let's say like scholars like Michelle Bowens and Jose Ramos, because they have this concept that I've just stuck, the term has really stuck with me, and they describe it as Cosmo Localism. And it seems like they're talking about the same kind of process you're describing here, in the sense that there are hyper-local solutions that are shared digitally in terms of scaling, in terms of other communities with their own context, but they can kind of pass notes along with each other in this sort of peer-to-peer network of experimental commons, bioregionalism, etc. So it sounds like you guys are really kind of trying to implement this new Cosmolocalism, but just curious if you're familiar with it.
I haven't personally heard of any of it, but we're trying to think appropriately for the scale and level that is right to think about. So on an individual basis, we're talking about these kind of conflict resolution practices. On the bioregional level, we're looking at what does the region need, how do other communities pop up in that region and share practices that are relevant to each other, and then what happens on the global level if this all scales across the planet. So it tends to be that when people are trying to figure out how to scale the thing they believe is good, they go to the government, they think super global, and they try and pass down some rule top down that goes all the way down to the individual, but that doesn't really work. It's like it always just ends up in some sort of tax policy. What we're thinking about is how do you build from the ground up? What is the life like of a person who lives regeneratively in the context of a small community in the region and on the globe? And I think there's a lot of responsibility put on the shoulders of the individuals and the governing bodies rather than the actual structure that people find themselves living in. So we've talked about this concept of stigmergy, which is like the organizational principle of hive creatures, ants and bees. And we've talked about what I've termed consciousness tripwires. So what about your environment can you design to set up the behaviors that you want? And this isn't really a super hard thing to do. Like having a Buddha on my desk isn't a religious thing. It isn't like reminding me I got to be super Buddhist today. It's just like all it does is remind me that I should be present. And maybe if I haven't meditated in a while, that would remind me to meditate. So it's kind of like a thing I've done to my environment to set up a type of consciousness.
I'll give another example. In Europe, the way that cities are designed is where there's little squares everywhere. So when you're walking outside of your house to the shop or whatever, you're always going to run into your neighbors, and there's always going to be a place where people are sitting or playing with their kids, hanging out. So you get to know the people that you're living with, in your community. Whereas in North America, everything is grid-like, and people get right into their car and go A to B and never meet their neighbors. That's also stigmergy or consciousness tripwires. Like the environment creates the behavior. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the behavior influences the environment again.
Another level would be like the smart in the smart villages, like using the technology to help do things for you that aren't necessarily natural to do. Like I remember being a kid and getting yelled at for leaving the door open or for leaving the lights on, like being conservative with energy. And I still have that habit of like forgetting to turn the lights off. So I just set up a motion sensor, have all my lights on a smart switch, and then when there's no motion detected in the room, the lights turn off, or set timers to turn them off or turn them on when we're away. Like little things like that people don't necessarily think of that can reduce the conscious output and allow us to focus on things that are actually more natural to us. So yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity in technological automation to create more room for individual consciousness.
And to get back to your question about cosmolocalism, I really like that term. And I'm not familiar with the scholars that you mentioned. I mean, I've heard the names, but I've never actually read their work. I think that the way that I approach it is more like holons. So there are wholes that operate at different scales, the individual scale, the community scale, bioregional scale, and global scale. And there are different patterns on those scales that are applicable both to that scale and to the things that it rests within. So, what works in a community in one bioregion might not apply to another one. For example, we're in the Canadian Rockies. Somebody who's in the tropics, they might have different things that work. But I'm trying to think about the meta. Like, what is the meta that is applicable to both of those situations? What are the processes by which people get to know something or figure something out? So, for example, there are processes of biomimicry or permaculture that are applicable to regardless of where you are in the world. Look at how different natural systems operate in your region, how different plants and animals interact, and what kind of adaptations they've come up with that you can learn from, because they've been there for much longer than we have. Humans are a very young species, and I like to think that all the plants and animals in each bioregion, they're elders that we can learn from. So we can just observe them and see how they've done it and replicate it. Yeah.
Awesome.
That's really interesting. When you were speaking, it reminded me of the book called Nudge, if you've heard of that one, where it's basically about having different kind of hacks in your environment to encourage behavior in certain ways. so it's designing the environment to the word they use is called Libertarian Paternalism, which is kind of like an oxymoron, but it's like you're still free to choose, but the environment is designed to nudge you in a certain way, right? So it's not like you're being forced to do anything. But this going back a little earlier when we were talking about the government and stuff, one of the reasons why we started this podcast is because the three of us are very passionate about politics on a national and on a global level. And one of my, because I'm such a politically oriented person, I'm a political animal. And so one of my dissatisfactions with the sense-making community was the lack of emphasis on politics and policy analysis. And I was like, there's so many smart guys here, right? There's so like Schmachtenberger and Hull, there's so many brilliant guys, and everyone's talking about this kind of local self-organizing, regeneration, all kind of stuff, which I'm all about. But how do we deal with, power structures? How do we talk about, different kind of policies that could help to encourage or engender these kind of movements we're talking about? And I was watching one of your live streams way back, and I think you were saying you were excited about Andrew Yang, who people know I was supportive of, and coincidentally I'm wearing my my shirt, my Yang 2020 shirt right now. But I'm just curious how you think about the role of politics, or the role of government and policy in our sense making, regenerative context. And do you think that we should focus more on that, or do you think that ultimately the answers are local and we should be doing more things like what you're doing?
Yep. I listen a lot to politics. I watch a lot of the YouTube videos, watching the debates and stuff like that. Constantly disappointed with the dialogue in politics. Even the system that we have set up of voting, I'm like, really, we're choosing between, two senile old men, or two psychopaths, or two corporate lackeys. Like, that's the best we can do. I've looked at different kind of political engagement systems, direct democracy and liquid democracy, blockchain solutions, stuff like that. I've never found anything that is super exciting, but I think plenty of things that are probably better than what we have. But I just don't think, even if you think bioregionally, there's no rules you can make up for your bioregion that will automatically apply to other bioregions. There are axioms of human behavior that you can probably apply, but you can't put that into a market system and incentivize people by giving them tax breaks to behave in a certain way. Really, you're just going to create this game theory dynamic all the time and create the exact same system or some variation of the same system we have. So, my experience traveling around the world and seeing these more communal structures and less power in the government, I've seen, people may not have as much money, but they definitely have a happier, more communal lifestyle.
Yeah, the incidence of suicide and
overdose,
depression and overdose and all of that is much, much lower.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think we've got it pretty wrong in the West. And I don't fit on either side of the political spectrum, because I think the whole conversation this is going to sound so arrogant, but it's so stupid. It's just ridiculous, the conversation that people are having out there about what Trump should do, or what Biden should do, or what Trudeau should do, and whatever. It's so atomized and so artificial in its simplicity. Like, it makes people think that that can be the extent of their decision making and thinking, is choose this guy or choose this guy. It's just, so I'm very disengaged, and I understand why people are so disengaged and why there's such a low voter turnout, because a lot of young, smart people are thinking like, this is it. This is the only way I can engage. Well, screw that. So
I'd rather be an entrepreneur or whatever,
Yeah. So our philosophy in as far as any engagement politically or otherwise has been seek forgiveness, not permission. Let's just do a thing that we think is the right thing to do, and hopefully it doesn't step on too many toes, and let's see where that leads. And that has always kind of turned out better. But as far as like Andrew Yang, going back to that, the reason I supported him was because, and I'm Canadian too, so we're talking mostly about American politics right now, but I don't really have a way to influence that, and I don't have a dog in that race. But Andrew Yang running on the platform of basic income. Like I can see the future when it comes to artificial intelligence and automation and stuff like that. And, you know, more jobs as a slogan is not going to get us anywhere. Like we can't stand in the way of that type of progress. People are going to need a means to live as jobs disappear and our whole economic system changes and potentially collapses. So I think a basic income may not be the big solution, but it's definitely a way to bridge to some new economic system. So I'm in support of that.
Yeah, I think that as far as political systems, the ones that we collectively as humans have been running on for the last several hundred years are just outdated, and based on some assumptions that are no longer working. And something new needs to come about. And I think that something new needs to be emergent from the processes that are happening bottom up. So, and something bioregional politics, definitely. But
Is
I
that your
can't,
slogan?
yeah, something bioregional politics, but I can't tell you exactly what it is. Because just like, you know, we're talking about what works in smart villages in one bioregion may not be applicable to another, I think it's the same with policy.
Yeah.
Good answer. I'm curious about your work with, I know you've had Joe Brewer on the show quite a few times, and I found him to be profoundly informative and educational for my own learning process about bioregionalism. And I know he talks quite a bit about this sort of macro perspective that we're headed into bioregional collapse, right? That like civilizational collapse is probably something that we as a species are not going to be able to avoid. And so the question becomes more of how do we transition and scale our species into whatever's coming next, right? How do we assist cultural evolution in a direction that will harm the least amount of people and the least amount of the environment or bioregions, etc. So I'm wondering if you kind of take that macro perspective too. A lot of my friends in the integral community and the consciousness culture also have that kind of looming sense of we really just need to be figuring out what comes next in terms of what's after civilization, because this isn't working.
Joe Brewer, I have an immense amount of respect for. He has spent the time to understand what is going on out there in the world, and also understand the personal emotional impact that those things are going to have, and then how people are going to be sovereign and be able to deal with the grief of climate collapse and massive systems change and all of this stuff. And he's hit on the two issues that I feel are the most important things. It's one is accepting the grief and being able to properly process trauma, which I think in our culture we're horrible at. We internalize trauma and then project it out into the world, and then go after the bad guy instead of actually looking at our own internal situation. So he does that. I'm fairly certain he's even held workshops on just processing the trauma of climate collapse and species loss. So that's number one, because you can't be sovereign if you're constantly operating from and responding to your trauma. And then the second part is he's done so much ego disillusion work that he's not concerned with every action that he takes being massively scalable. Like he's out there when it rains, he's out there digging ditches to make wells for water, because that's the problem that he's having in his community right now. He's not saying this job is below me. He's saying this is the thing that needs to get done. So, and those types of actions are what needs to scale up. Personal responsibility and not believing work is below you and just doing what needs to be done most now.
Exactly. So it's that process by which you discover what needs to be done rather than the specific action that we all, robotically take. Like, go vote, or whatever, or recycle, like, and then people just start repeating that and not thinking about it. Yeah.
Euvie, I have a question for you. I know in the integral community, there appears to be an imbalance between masculine male participation. Women in the sense making community, do you think there is a reason for this? And is there anything we can do more in sense making communities to invite more feminine female participation?
It's a good question, and one that I've been thinking about myself for a long time. I've definitely had a tendency to play in the boys' sandbox for my whole life. So for me, it seems normal to be engaging in these conversations. But at the same time, I do see that there are fewer women and fewer people of color as well. And I haven't figured out for sure why that is, but I have a hunch. And my hunch is that the whole way of thinking about things that the sense making or integral or some of these other circles present is just inherently masculine. Like it originates from the masculine psyche and how the masculine psyche organizes information. And the feminine ways of knowing or indigenous ways of knowing are actually different, like foundationally different with how and I'm not saying how we arrive as like people, but it's the process that is different, like the feminine way of knowing or indigenous way of knowing. But I think that's changing. I've, especially in recent months, I feel like there's been a lot more interest in indigenous thinkers. Like, we talked to Tyson Yunkaporta, and in September we chose indigenous wisdom as the theme in our community. So we're reading his book and reading Braiding Sweetgrass as well by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And although I do recognize that these thinkers are kind of like they're of mixed ethnicity, so they're bridging the gap. But I think that is really important, bridging the gap, because the culture, the Western culture, or even these subcultures, like integral, they are very masculine, and they're not necessarily incentivized to go and learn about other ways of knowing or perceiving the world unless that bridge is created by somebody else who is able to think in that masculine way and put it in those terms that makes sense within the sense making kind of way of thinking or the integral way of thinking. Does that make sense, what I'm describing?
To me, it does. Yeah.
I'm not sure that it's a complete thought.
Well,
I kind of want to urge.
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Well, I was going to say, I kind of want to urge you into the controversial territory here, because it would be fun and interesting.
Okay, sure. Challenge me.
Well, what of your thinking on these subjects of race and diversity and inclusion and all of that do you think goes against the grain of what is commonly accepted?
Can you ask that question in a different way? I'm not really sure what you're pointing at. I know that you're trying. I know what you're trying to do, but I'm not really sure about exactly what you're asking.
Just make your best attempt. It's open-ended.
This feels like a game show, and I have to kind of be the host to kind of decide. It's like, whose line is it anyway, or what is? I'm not sure which game show this would be, but this is interesting.
Yeah, this is where we get into the best conversations, and so when we kind of lean into something that's dangerous.
Okay, so I'll say one thing first, that I think that diversity of skin color is a lot less interesting than diversity in ways of knowing. Because
diversity of thought.
Well, not just thought, and that's exactly why I said.
Did we lose audio? Mike?
I can't hear.
Sorry, I accidentally hit the mute button.
Right when Euvie was about to...
Accidentally?
Yeah, right.
So you said diversity of thought, and this is exactly why I said diversity of ways of knowing, because thought is the primary operating mode of the sense-making sphere or the integral sphere, and feeling or intuition or physical sensing or ancestral knowledge or any of these other ways of knowing are de-emphasized. And in feminine ways of knowing or indigenous ways of knowing, they are more emphasized. And I think that's actually the primary difference. That I can sense into something and not have like a logical thought to explain something, but it would still be a very valuable and valid insight that has consequences if acted upon, that may be dismissed, you know, because I don't have some perfect logical explanation for it. And so, for example, when I got pregnant, my hormonal profile changed completely. So I started perceiving the world in a very different way. And certain things became more important to me, and certain things just became silly and completely unimportant. And I do recognize that it is because of this biological process happening in my body, but it still changed my consciousness and my perception so much, that it was like being a different person. And perhaps, you know, although men, of course, experience, you know, different changes in their body, like when you're sick or when you're hungry, you're in a different frame of mind. But, you know, pregnancy is such a persistent thing that it forced me into this completely different consciousness that I had to learn how to operate from. I felt like a toddler learning how to walk again, you know, because it was so different. And like, how do I explain this? Well, just honoring that is, I realize that it's really important that there's this kind of motherhood consciousness that is different.
So let's move back a bit to the question. I think your answer is fantastic, but I'm curious about what, because a lot of the time it's like a bunch of dudes in a room trying to figure out how to be more diverse, right? And because often like it's the external world urging them, doesn't like to see a bunch of white dudes in a room, wants to see more diversity. So they're kind of like, okay, well, I guess let's just make a quota system and let's make sure we've got, you know, the whole rainbow represented here in the conversation. But what do you propose is a better way to go about diversity, and rather than skin color or race or gender? Like, how do we change the diversity profile if that's the right thing to optimize for?
Yeah. I'm going to just say what has worked in my experience. And I don't know if this necessarily scales or works across the board, but I think finding those people who are bridges to different ways of knowing and can explain it both ways is super important. People like Robin Wall Kimmerer, people like Tyson Yunkaporta, people like Don Roberto, which is the ayahuasca shaman that we've interviewed, who you know, goes and studies with Shipibo natives for many months out of the year, even though, you know, he grew up in UK and Indonesia, and he's not from that Shipibo heritage, but he studies with them and lives with them for extended periods of time, that he's able to communicate, at least in some form, those different ways of knowing. So yeah, finding those bridge people who can put it into the terms of the dominant culture, and then from there take you to different ways of knowing and understanding the world.
Great answer. I love the kind of micro conversation, actually, as you're interviewing Euvie and kind of bringing this element out. No, this is good.
I hijacked the interview.
It was good, though. It was a rich question. But you know, plus one for the mimetic mediators here, right, Ryan? In terms of the answer. But this is one of the reasons why I think I have personally gravitated towards, let's say, the work of Jean Gebser over somebody like Ken Wilber, because in Gebser's work, the whole structures of consciousness are very much implicitly expressing what you're talking about, Euvie, and that, you know, the magical structure, the mythic, and folks may not be familiar with this terminology, that's okay, but these are descriptive attempts to express different ways of knowing that may not be conceptual, intellectual, they may be intuitive, they may be imagistic or analogic, and yet they have their own kind of, even the phrases in our language are too like mental oriented, because I was going to say they have their own genius, and it's like maybe in a spiritual sense, yes, or a different sense, but they're complementary rather than stepping on one another in some kind of stage-centric, developmental, progressive, okay, magic is down here and then mental is up here in terms of our evolution, right? So like we're this what you're describing is a kind of anthropological pluralism that like that's how we are truly global. That's how we actually can be diverse, is to actually hold space for different worldviews and then value the folks who can cross those bridges and come back and forth and actually create connection, right? Because that's what those individuals do. They link people up who need a translator, and I think that's just so important. So yeah, really appreciated your answers there.
Can I just jump in on the diversity thing real quickly? There is a book that I recommend called The Diversity Bonus, and it's all about kind of developing a meta science of diversity, including what are the different types of diversity, what projects or issues are they important for, and then how do you manage the diversity so that you can get kind of a net bonus that's more than the sum of its parts. And for me, diversity of skin color can be important depending on what subject you're talking about, because different groups have different lived experiences in a non-colorblind society, and that actually allows people to gravitate towards different thought systems that people of a certain group or dominant culture may not see. So an example I'll give is that Ken Wilber in his book Integral Psychology lists like 100 different developmental schemes and kind of cross-references them in a big meta chart. But he missed one that was very important, which was ethnic identity development. And our friend David Hartful, who's an integral theorist and Black activist, is developing his own kind of like integral, what should we call it, like Black liberation movement and philosophy. And he really goes into this idea of ethnic identity development. And I think it's like one of the most powerful things I've ever seen, and think it could even save America from all the conflict with race and everything. And for whatever reason, Wilbur just forgot about that or didn't include that. Probably because of his race, right? Probably because as a white guy, he wasn't really interested in that. And so it took a Black person who was interested in developmental theory to find a developmental theory that really talks about how ethnic identity progresses through stages, and how we can have a more integrative or holistic or meta-modern form of dealing with identity issues, which I think is so important these days. So I do think that I do want to kind of throw in my 2 cents of why I do think it's kind of important to look out for that. And then how we can, as you were saying, Euvie, right, build bridges to these different communities. And the last thing I'll just say too, just my 2 cents, is there's a lot of like allergy and hostility in the sense-speaking communities to like wokeness and stuff. And so one of the things I'm really leaning into is trying to steelman the woke identity stuff as much as I can to try to have the most healthy, most nuanced, most complex articulation or expression of that. And unfortunately, what happened like in integrals, there's a lot of that allergy to like the green or mean, whatever. And our friend David Hartford, he's Black, and people were just strawmanning him and attacking him and his project so much that he left a lot of these groups. And that just made me feel really sad. So that would be another thing I would say to make it more inclusive, is like try to not go all in on this destroying the woke stuff, and because that could be certain insights of from that ideology could be meaningful and important to people of different marginalized groups and so forth. So it's a very like controversial, heated topic. So I'm like a heat-seeking missile. I'm just like, oh yeah, let's just go right into it. But that's just what I kind of like to respond to.
Are your audience fairly familiar with integral theory?
Yes,
Yeah?
I would say so.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So how is the guy, the Black guy you had mentioned, what's his name?
David Hartful.
David Hartful. Okay, so he was saying there's a missing piece in integral theory. I'm trying to understand how it's different than kind of the, I suppose, tribal purple, I think, right? How is it different than
Tribal
blue? Yeah, I'm sorry, I might be getting the colors wrong here, but basically like group identity.
So it's basically how and there's different researches done for different ethnic groups, like in America. So he's focusing on something called the Negresance model, which is Black identity development, and it goes through a stage. The first stage is like what's called pre-encounter, which is before you become self-conscious of your race, before you're racialized by society, you have this kind of blissful ignorance of, I'm just a human being in the world as like a 4-year-old kid. And then you become conscious of your race. And then what happens is you can go into different divergent paths. One is to become a conscious embrace of your race. Like, now I'm proud to be Black, and it's, Cornel West calls it the race embracing rebel. And then you go to the stage after that, which is called race, which Cornel West calls like race transcendence, where basically your identity that you've internalized, your racialized identity, becomes decentered, and you can have multiple identities, multiple perspectives, and multiple saliencies. So what I talk about, I describe it as being able to see through the construct of race and have the meta awareness to understand how that was constructed, and then disidentifying from that by turning that subject into an object and kind of expressing that as an integral stage of development, right? So there is a path to a kind of an integral, meta-modern, holistic, multi-perspectival, multi-dimensional consciousness through talking about and progressing through race. And I've joined a lot of social justice and activist and woke groups, kind of pitching this implicitly to see if I can kind of nudge it towards a more complex, more integral, understanding of the topic. So yeah, that's just, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. But it still kind of fits into the integral model that I have in my head here. And what you described of transcending the race seems very second tier. Like, it seems like a movement through blue and green into second tier. So I'm just kind of struggling to find where the model is outside of what Ken Wilber has imagined with integral theory.
Maybe it's what you're talking about is that it's a different line of development.
Exactly that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so he just didn't mention that line of development.
Right.
Right. Yeah. Or you mentioned it sort of generally speaking, but like in particular what David Hartful's doing is really kind of bringing that to the forefront, which makes sense. People of color would be very interested in that. Mexican American, for me, ethnic identity development might be important, etc. So, but I wanted to ask this because we got a good question in the stream that was kind of dovetailing into my question. Would be, when it comes to regenerative culture, different ways of knowing, integral theory, this sort of macro historical process of climate collapse that we're in, these are tremendously important topics and subjects and things to act on in our lives, and yet most people, live in urban environments in the modern world, and typically are working class urban environment. So how do we access and reach and become, how do we reach those folks? How do we actually help people scale in a way that is not just reaching, let's say, predominantly white, somewhat affluent, entrepreneurial, millennial, nomadic millennials? Like, I think a lot of us and a lot of the consciousness culture is that, right? But how do we actually reach the majority in terms of these kinds of topics and questions? What do we do? What are some strategies? I get the intuition that these are also ambassador or mediational strategies, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, I think there's kind of a problem in the implication that it needs to be broadcast to the world. We're talking about our smart village and getting the word out there, we're getting some pushback from people locally because they don't want such a huge spotlight on their community. And so we're kind of stepping away from the media a little bit and trying to focus on our actions as much as possible rather than the words and broadcasting that. Because if we can live what we say we're doing, it's far more likely to be of interest to people in the region. So, yeah.
Yeah, my answer was going to be very similar. It's about practice. It's about everyday things instead of lofty ideas. Nora Bateson talks about this. She says that in her work with warm data, the people in marginalized communities are actually the best at practicing complexity. Like, the people who are affluent are good at talking about complexity, but they're actually really bad at practicing it. And it's the opposite with people who are living in marginalized neighborhoods where, well, just reality smacks you in the face constantly, and you have to deal with complex social dynamics. What if, like, what if your boss is an abusive alcoholic, but you can't afford to get another job, so you just have to deal with those complexities arising, with those difficult interpersonal relationships, financial exchanges, and like, what if he's your neighbor too? So like, even if you do quit, he's still right there. So things like that, like that's complexity that is lived. So yeah, I think that bringing ideas to the masses is not necessarily the unit of change. I think practice is the
Yeah.
unit of change.
It's like you can't go on a campaign to get people to become more spiritual or become enlightened. They have to come to the material themselves. They have to do the work. Same thing with individual sovereignty. Same thing with any type of education. Like, people who don't want to learn won't actively seek anything out. And I think, to Euvie's note, the people outside of, I guess, Western colonialist culture are probably in the best position to take advantage of these ideas and they don't even need the broadcast medium. They're kind of living it already in a lot of ways. Like, if you don't have as much money, you can't afford to live in this atomized Western way. You have to live communally. That's just the nature of it. So, when we talk about the broadcast format and sharing this information, I actually kind of think it is made for the Western colonialists, patriarchy of capitalists, like that sort of thing, because it's showing them the possibility that there's something outside of their lifestyle, and that possibility is actually good for everyone, will enrich their lives just as much as everyone else's.
In some ways, they're the deepest in the matrix.
Yeah. And they're the ones that are going to really suffer the most from the change, because it's such a far leap from where they're at.
Yes. In most of the world, the collapse has already happened. Like, we were living in Bulgaria, and I'm Russian. Like, I grew up in the collapse of the Soviet Union. So that's already happened, like, many decades ago. And the consequences are still unfolding.
Yeah. As William Gibson says, when he's talking about the future not being evenly distributed, I keep thinking about climate collapse as something that is happening in the present. It's just not evenly distributed. But I think my question was more of, and this is leaning more into like what we often talk about on Growing Down, not so much in broadcasting in terms of like get the message out, but actively working with communities that are interested in that kind of cosmolocal practice of, let's say, urban permaculture experiments, working class communities that are interested in developing more resilient economic practices, from building cooperatives to, because those kinds of practices, like you're saying, are naturally like woven into living in the working class life or in marginalized communities. Communalism is already very present because we recognize how, needed it actually is. So I guess this might be, I guess I'm kind of answering the question, right? Like, it seems to be more on case by case. Like, if you have some kind of bioregional practice and you're working with communities in an inner city, like, that's just person to person. That's actually like, you have to build and stitch that at a human level. And it seems like that's kind of the answer you're saying here, right? Like, contextually based responses based on like where you're involved, who you're developing a particular project with, etc. So.
Yeah, finding what the opportunities are locally. For example, in Bulgaria, there are all these abandoned villages because after the collapse of the communist regime, all those incentives and all that government funding that went into rural development dried up, and people left the villages to work in the cities, and so there's all these super old houses that are abandoned. And there's a huge, it's the case for actually all of the Mediterranean. It's the same in Italy and Spain and Portugal. So there's a huge opportunity for a rural revival with the existing structures, with retrofitting them, with repopulating those villages. There's some very, very fertile land there that can be used. So, there's an opportunity. Somebody can go after that and do it. In other places, there's maybe mass agriculture that has destroyed soils, so that would be a priority for someone to focus on. So it's very specific to each area, I think.
I suppose when we're talking about spreading the ideas, we can also talk about like memes, you know, regenerative practices is a meme, or soil regeneration is a meme, food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, this sort of stuff. Because there's kind of like a series of practices when it comes to operating in a permaculture type way. Like there's, you know, the basic necessities of life, your food, your water, your energy, your shelter, your waste, the community. So, you know, there are ways to customize each of these to your local region, to your community, and to figure out where the biggest problems and needs are. But as far as it comes down to like this unit of impact in the world, like the thing that can be most beneficial, I think the word regenerative is probably it. And that's eventually going to get co-opted and bastardized and changed and everything. But right now, the way that word speaks to me is leave the world better than you left it, or than you arrived at it. So figuring out what that to-do list that comes out of that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There's a Tolkien quote from Lord of the Rings that amounts to pretty much that. I can't quite recall it offhand, but basically it's, you know, all we can really do with what the time that we're given is to basically make sure that the next generation has, you know, soil to work with to grow their food.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of the things that a lot of indigenous traditions talk about is living in a way that 7 generations ahead of you, you're thinking about the 7 generations ahead of you and honoring the 7 generations back. So I think that kind of position in deep time, if we're able to contemplate that deeply and live in that way, is going to make a lot of difference.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that it's can sound very alien and foreign to people who are just living go go go, you know, trying to make ends meet. And I don't have the answer for that other than just making time.
Yeah, there's deep cultural conditioning that says you've got to be productive every minute of the day. And it's not even just the conditioning, it's also the realities of the economic system. Like you kind of do need to be productive every minute of the day if you want to see a project happen, or if you want to, like building this village, we're, you know, running ourselves into the ground in a way to make it happen. So yeah, there's an issue with the way we're set up in Western civilization that requires that from us at a deep economic and psychological level that is very difficult to step out of. And I'm aware of these subjects, and I'm aware of the personal development stuff, and I still get caught in it all the time. And I think that's where it comes back to like the consciousness tripwires and the environment and the stigmergic environment. Like we have to figure out a way to set ourselves up both economically and environmentally that 24/7 work weeks are not required, you know, that we don't have to have that full-time job, that we can start to think about tasks and projects that aren't economically viable, but are in that 7 generation time, deep time thing that Euvie talked about.
Yeah.
You know, planting a tree is not going to have any impact on your immediate life because that tree is going to take a long time to grow. Mm-hmm. But doing that task, even though you have no income, no monetary incentive, is critical. And the way we're set up doesn't allow for that.
Yeah. I like that we're kind of wrapping it up here, coming towards the end with the theme of time. That's something that comes up quite a bit for us with Gebser's phenomenology of time, which he talks about. Like integral consciousness is a concretization of time. It's a sense of transparency in terms of inhabiting that deep time perspective, bringing forward the ancestors. So there's a kind of deep forward time, deep back time, and a participation and involvement in that. And I think anything that we can do with our systems, our enculturation, even just memetics, and just getting this notion out there that we could reclaim time and inhabit time differently is just so important. So, and any other questions, guys, before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I have one last one. I know, speaking of complexity and more on the microcosm level, Mike, you were sharing that you have a 10-month-old son. And I know that really, being a dad myself, sort of alters how your life is lives, pretty much moving forward. And you've kind of mentioned how motherhood changed you. Just curious from both of your guys' perspective, how has being a mom and dad, having a son, sort of changed and altered your life?
I suppose patience. I'm more patient just naturally than I thought I would be, you know? Like I thought I would have to do a lot of personal work to just have the patience, but just loving your flesh and blood uh, right there in front of you comes so easily and naturally that it's there. It didn't seem like I need to pile on a bunch of personal development work on top of what I've already done to be able to do a good job with him, I guess. And the other thing that's become apparent is how important play is. Like almost to the same note of what we were just talking about, making space, not having to fill up every minute of the day with work and time and tasks. You know, he needs attention and interaction, and he kind of needs it all day long. And we're fortunate enough to be with some extended family here, so that he does get opportunities to hang out and play with people in different generations. And you know, it's a good experience for him. But if we were in that sort of atomized setup of just mom and dad, it would be extremely difficult to do that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of how it changed me. I don't know, it changed everything. It just changed my whole perspective on what's important and what's not, and really emphasized the need to be in community and to live in this deep time, because, you know, now we have a descendant and I have to think about his children and his children's children. And, you know, now you know, if, and I hope he has children, but even if he doesn't, we have to be good ancestors. So we're not just living for ourselves anymore, and not just for like our immediate community and our family. It feels like there's just something, there's this ancestral line that is created now, and I have to be responsible for the world that we create, that we won't even see, because there are other people that are going to be living in it. Yeah.
Great way
That's
to.
beautiful.
Well,
Yeah, thank you.
many blessings, and he's very fortunate to have two forward-thinking parents to raise him in the changing world.
Two future
Thanks.
thinkers. Well, thanks, Mike and
Yeah.
Euvie. It's been great. Really appreciated your time, and I'd love to continue this conversation in the near future, see how the smart villages are going, and staying in contact with all your projects. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you guys. This
Yeah,
has been
thank
a
you
lot
so
of
much,
fun.
guys.
Yeah, thanks for having
Look
us.
forward to visiting.
Yes, exactly.
Awesome.
All right.